The crisp autumn morning cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Margaret Whitfield adjusted her leather briefcase and checked her watch for the third time. The Royal Archives building stood before her like a fortress of secrets, its Gothic windows reflecting the pale October sun. As Queen Camilla's senior research assistant, Margaret had made this journey countless times over the past 2 years, but today felt different. There was an electricity in the air that made her skin prickle with unease. Margaret had been working for the Queen Consort since shortly after the coronation, tasked with the delicate job of researching and organizing historical documents that related to the royal family's public engagements and charitable work. It was prestigious work that required the highest level of discretion and security clearance. The Queen relied on her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to uncover historical precedents that could inform current royal protocols and ceremonies. Today's mission was particularly sensitive. Queen Camilla had requested specific documents relating to previous queen consorts and their roles in state ceremonies from the 1920s through the 1950s. The research was needed for an upcoming Commonwealth gathering where historical protocols would be crucial for maintaining diplomatic relationships with member nations. Margaret had been granted special access to restricted sections of the archives, sections that even most royal staff never saw. As she approached the heavy oak doors of the archives, Margaret noticed the unusual number of guards stationed around the building. Typically, there were 2 ceremonial guards at the main entrance and perhaps 1 or 2 security personnel inside. Today, she counted at least 6 guards in their distinctive red tunics and bearskin hats, their faces stern and alert beneath the morning light. The sight made her pause mid-step, her briefcase suddenly feeling heavier in her hand. The lead guard, a tall man with steel-gray eyes and military bearing, stepped forward as she approached. His name tag read Sergeant Thompson, and Margaret recognized him from previous visits, though he had always been cordial before. Today, his expression was unreadable, professional in a way that seemed almost cold. "Good morning, Sergeant Thompson," Margaret said, attempting her usual friendly tone while reaching for her identification badge. "I'm here for my scheduled research session. Queen Camilla is expecting a preliminary report by this afternoon." The sergeant's response was not what she expected. Instead of the usual nod and wave-through, he held up a white-gloved hand, signaling her to stop. "I'm afraid I'll need to see your authorization documents today, Miss Whitfield." "All of them." Margaret felt a flutter of confusion in her chest. "My authorization documents? But surely my royal appointment letter and security clearance are sufficient, as they have been for the past 2 years. She reached into her briefcase, pulling out the familiar folder that contained her credentials. These documents had never been questioned before, and she had used them just last week to access the same restricted sections. Sergeant Thompson examined her papers with unusual scrutiny, his eyes scanning every line as if seeing them for the first time. The other guards had formed a subtle semicircle around the entrance, their presence more noticeable than ever before. Margaret could feel the weight of their collective gaze, and it made her increasingly uncomfortable. The morning air seemed to grow colder as clouds drifted across the sun, casting the courtyard into temporary shadow. "These documents appear to be in order," the sergeant finally said, though his tone suggested anything but satisfaction. "However, I've been instructed to verify all access requests through additional channels today. You'll need to wait while I make some calls." The word "wait" hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret had never been asked to wait before. Her access had always been immediate, seamless, and without question. The Queen's work was time-sensitive, and delays could affect important diplomatic preparations. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling increasingly anxious as the minutes ticked by. "I understand the need for security," Margaret said carefully. "But perhaps you could make your calls while I begin my research. I have a very specific list of documents that Her Majesty requires, and the work is quite urgent. The Commonwealth representatives arrive tomorrow, and the Queen needs to review the historical protocols before her afternoon meetings." Sergeant Thompson's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid that won't be possible today, Miss Whitfield. New security protocols are in effect as of this morning. No one enters the restricted archives without explicit verification, regardless of their previous access privileges or the urgency of their mission." The phrase "new security protocols" sent a chill down Margaret's spine. In her experience, security changes at the royal level didn't happen overnight unless something significant had occurred. She wondered if there had been a security breach she wasn't aware of, or perhaps intelligence about a potential threat to the royal family. The guards' heightened alertness suddenly made more sense, but it didn't make her situation any less frustrating. As she waited, Margaret observed the unusual activity around the archives building. Staff members who would normally be coming and going freely were being stopped and questioned. She recognized several researchers and archivists who looked just as confused as she felt. Dr. Harrison, the chief archivist who had always greeted her warmly, emerged from the building looking flustered and worried. When he spotted Margaret, he approached with obvious concern. "Miss Whitfield, I'm so sorry about this delay," Dr. Harrison said quietly, glancing nervously at the guards. "There seems to be some confusion about access permissions today. I've been trying to sort it out from my end, but the orders came from very high up in the royal household hierarchy." Margaret felt her anxiety increasing. What kind of orders? And why wasn't I notified if my access was being changed? I spoke with the Queen's private secretary just yesterday to confirm today's research schedule. Dr. Harrison lowered his voice even further. "That's just it. Nobody seems to know exactly what's happening. The orders came through very early this morning, before most of the senior staff arrived. All I know is that certain access permissions have been temporarily suspended pending a review of security protocols." The word temporarily offered some hope, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something more serious was at play. She had worked in royal circles long enough to understand that sudden changes in protocol usually indicated significant behind-the-scenes developments. The royal household was normally a well-oiled machine where every detail was planned and communicated well in advance. Sergeant Thompson returned from his phone calls, his expression even more serious than before. "Miss Whitfield, I'm afraid there's been a development regarding your access authorization. I need you to come with me to the security office for additional verification procedures." Margaret's heart began to race. "Additional verification procedures?" "Sergeant Thompson, I've had security clearance for Royal Archives access for over 2 years. My background has been thoroughly vetted by the Royal Protection Service. What exactly is the nature of these additional procedures?" The sergeant's response was formal and unyielding. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics, Miss Whitfield. I can only tell you that new information has come to light that requires a review of certain access privileges. This is not a reflection on your character or your service to Her Majesty, but rather a precautionary measure that must be followed." The phrase, "new information has come to light," was particularly unsettling. Margaret couldn't imagine what information could have emerged that would affect her security clearance. She had been scrupulously careful in all her work, maintaining the highest standards of confidentiality and professionalism. Her personal life was unremarkable and transparent, and she had never had any financial difficulties or questionable associations that might raise security concerns. As they walked toward the security office, Margaret tried to process what was happening. The building that had always felt welcoming and familiar now seemed fortress-like and intimidating. Other staff members they passed looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy, making her feel as though she was being escorted under arrest rather than simply following security procedures. The security office was a small, windowless room that Margaret had never seen before. It contained a simple desk, 2 chairs, and several filing cabinets that looked as though they held sensitive documents. Sergeant Thompson gestured for her to sit while he took the chair across from her, creating an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation than a verification procedure. "Miss Whitfield," the sergeant began, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is confidential and must not be discussed with anyone outside of this room without proper authorization. The security review of your access privileges has been ordered directly by His Majesty the King." Margaret felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. The king himself had ordered her access to be reviewed? This was far more serious than she had imagined. King Charles III didn't involve himself in routine security matters unless something significant was at stake. Her mind raced through every recent interaction, every document she had accessed, every conversation she had had with Queen Camilla or her staff. "I don't understand," Margaret managed to say. "Has there been some kind of complaint about my work? Has someone questioned my handling of sensitive materials? I've always followed every protocol to the letter." Sergeant Thompson consulted a document that he produced from a locked drawer. According to the information I have, there are concerns about the nature of some of your recent research requests. Specifically, requests that go beyond the scope of your original mandate and delve into areas that require higher levels of clearance. But all of my research requests have come directly from Queen Camilla or her private secretary. I don't initiate research on my own. I only investigate what Her Majesty specifically requests. Every single document I've accessed has been in service of the Queen's official duties. The sergeant made notes as she spoke, his expression remaining carefully neutral. Can you provide specific details about your research activities over the past month? Particularly any requests that involve documents from the 1930s and 1940s, or materials related to previous abdications or constitutional crises. The specific nature of his questions alarmed Margaret. She had indeed been researching documents from that era, but only because Queen Camilla had specifically asked for historical precedents related to royal ceremonies and protocols during times of national transition. The research had been academic in nature, focused on understanding how previous generations of royals had handled certain ceremonial duties during challenging periods in British history. Yes, I have been researching that time period, Margaret admitted, but only at Queen Camilla's direct request. She wanted to understand the historical context for certain Commonwealth protocols, particularly how previous queen consorts had navigated their roles during significant political and social changes. The research was meant to inform her approach to upcoming diplomatic events. Sergeant Thompson made more notes, his pen scratching across the paper in the quiet room. Were you aware that some of the documents you accessed contained information that has never been publicly released? Information about internal royal family discussions and decisions that remain classified even today. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had accessed various documents as part of her research, always focusing on the specific information that Queen Camilla had requested. If some of those documents contained classified information beyond what she had been looking for, she hadn't been aware of it. The archives were organized in such a way that individual documents often contained multiple types of information, and researchers typically focused on the specific details relevant to their inquiry. I was only looking for information about ceremonial protocols and public duties, Margaret explained. If there was classified information in those documents, I wasn't specifically seeking it out or taking notes on it. My focus was entirely on the Queen's research requirements. The sergeant looked up from his notes. Miss Whitfield, I want to be clear that you're not being accused of any wrongdoing at this time. However, the King's security advisors have determined that certain types of research require additional oversight and approval. Your access is being suspended, not because of anything you've done wrong, but because the parameters of allowable research are being revised. This explanation provided some relief, but Margaret still felt deeply unsettled by the entire situation. Her work was her passion, and her role in supporting Queen Camilla was something she took enormous pride in. The thought that she might have inadvertently accessed information she shouldn't have seen, or that her research methods might have somehow violated protocols, was deeply troubling. What happens now? Margaret asked. How long will the suspension last, and how will this affect the Queen's research needs? She's depending on my work for tomorrow's Commonwealth meetings. Sergeant Thompson closed his notebook and looked at her with what might have been sympathy. The review process typically takes several days to complete. During that time, you'll need to refrain from accessing any royal archives or discussing the specifics of your recent research with anyone outside of the official review process. As for the Queen's immediate research needs, alternative arrangements are being made. The mention of alternative arrangements stung. Margaret had worked hard to build her expertise in royal historical research and to understand exactly what kinds of information Queen Camilla found most useful. The idea that she could be replaced so quickly made her realize how precarious her position might be, despite her 2 years of dedicated service. As they prepared to leave the security office, Sergeant Thompson handed her a document that outlined the terms of her suspension and the confidentiality requirements she would need to observe. The official language was intimidating, full of legal terminology that emphasized the serious nature of the security review and the potential consequences of violating the terms of her suspension. Walking back across the courtyard toward the castle gates, Margaret felt as though the familiar surroundings had become alien and unwelcoming. The guards who had once nodded respectfully now watched her with professional detachment. The building that had been her second home for 2 years now felt like a place she might never see again. The morning that had started with such promise and purpose had turned into a nightmare of uncertainty and anxiety. As she passed through the castle gates and into the busy streets of Windsor, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what had really prompted this sudden security review and whether her career in royal service was about to come to an abrupt and devastating end. Margaret spent the rest of that day in her small flat overlooking the Thames, unable to concentrate on anything except the morning's events. The suspension document lay on her kitchen table like an accusation, its formal language seeming to mock her years of dedicated service. She had read it dozens of times, searching for clues about what had triggered the security review, but the bureaucratic prose revealed nothing beyond the basic facts of her temporary banishment from the archives. By evening, her anxiety had transformed into determination. If she was going to lose her position, she at least deserved to understand why. Margaret had always prided herself on her professional integrity and her careful adherence to royal protocols. The suggestion that her research had somehow overstepped boundaries was not only professionally damaging, but personally devastating. She decided to reach out to Dr. Harrison, hoping the chief archivist might have learned more about the situation since their brief conversation that morning. His phone went straight to voicemail, which was unusual. Dr. Harrison was normally very responsive to calls from royal staff, even in the evenings. Margaret left a carefully worded message asking if he had any additional information about the security review procedures and when she might expect to hear about the results. The next morning brought no news from Dr. Harrison, but it did bring an unexpected visitor. Margaret's doorbell rang just after 9 o'clock, and she opened the door to find a woman in her 50s, wearing an elegant navy coat and carrying an expensive handbag. The woman's bearing and dress suggested royal household staff of a senior level, though Margaret didn't recognize her. "Miss Whitfield? I'm Victoria Pemberton from the Queen's private office. May I come in? I believe we need to have a conversation about your recent work." Margaret's heart began to race. Victoria Pemberton was a name she had heard whispered in royal circles, Queen Camilla's most trusted advisor and the person responsible for managing the Queen's most sensitive personal and political affairs. If Victoria Pemberton was at her door, the situation was even more serious than Margaret had feared. "Of course, please come in," Margaret said, stepping aside to allow her visitor to enter. "Can I offer you tea? Coffee?" Victoria declined refreshments and settled onto Margaret's modest sofa with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations. Her expression was professional but not unkind, suggesting that she viewed Margaret more as a problem to be solved than as a threat to be eliminated. "Miss Whitfield, I want to begin by assuring you that your professional reputation and your loyalty to Her Majesty are not in question," Victoria said. "However, your recent research activities have inadvertently intersected with some very sensitive royal family matters, and we need to discuss the implications of that intersection." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. "Mrs. Pemberton, I've been trying to understand what I might have done wrong. Every research request I've pursued has come directly from Queen Camilla or through her private secretary. I've never initiated independent research or sought information beyond what was specifically requested." Victoria nodded. "That's exactly what makes this situation so delicate. You haven't done anything wrong, but you've uncovered information that certain members of the royal family would prefer to remain confidential. Your research into historical protocols from the 1930s and 1940s has brought to light some documents that contain information about family dynamics and decision-making processes that are still considered sensitive today." Margaret tried to recall the specific documents she had accessed during that research period. Most of her work had focused on ceremonial procedures and public appearances by Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, during her early years as Queen Consort. She had been looking for precedents that might guide Queen Camilla's approach to similar ceremonial duties in the modern era. "I was researching Queen Elizabeth's early ceremonial roles," Margaret said carefully, "specifically how she handled Commonwealth relations during the period when King George VI was establishing his reign after the abdication crisis. Queen Camilla wanted to understand the historical approaches to building relationships with Commonwealth leaders during times of constitutional transition." Victoria's expression suggested that Margaret had identified exactly the problem area. "Yes, That research led you to access documents that contain details about the royal family's private discussions during the abdication crisis and its aftermath. Those documents include conversations, correspondence, and decision-making processes that revealed significant tensions within the royal family at that time. Margaret began to understand the scope of the problem. The abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936 had been one of the most traumatic events in modern royal history, forcing his brother George VI to assume the throne unexpectedly and under difficult circumstances. If her research had uncovered details about the family's private struggles during that transition, she could see why that information might be considered sensitive even today.
I was only looking for information about public ceremonies and diplomatic protocols, Margaret explained.
If I accessed documents that contained private family information, it was incidental to my research focus. I certainly didn't take notes on or report any personal details about the royal family's private discussions. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Miss Whitfield, I believe you when you say that wasn't your intention. However, the documents you accessed contain information that some current members of the royal family believe could be damaging if it ever became public. There are concerns about the security of that information and who might have access to it. The phrase, some current members of the royal family, was particularly telling. Margaret had worked in royal circles long enough to understand that family dynamics within the House of Windsor could be complex, and that different family members sometimes had different views about what information should remain private and what could be shared more openly. Are you saying that someone in the royal family specifically requested that my access be suspended? Margaret asked. Victoria chose her words carefully. I'm saying that when your research activities came to the attention of certain family members, they expressed concerns about the potential security implications. Those concerns were brought to the king's attention, and he made the decision to review the access protocols for that particular category of historical documents. Margaret felt a growing sense that she was caught in the middle of larger royal family politics that she didn't fully understand. Queen Camilla had requested the research in good faith, seeking information that would help her fulfill her constitutional duties more effectively. But apparently that research had touched on areas that other family members considered off-limits. What exactly did the documents contain? Margaret asked. I mean, what specific information has caused such concern? I'm trying to understand how my research for Queen Camilla's ceremonial preparations could have created a security issue. Victoria hesitated before answering. The documents you accessed include correspondence between King George VI and various government officials during the months following the abdication. That correspondence reveals the king's private thoughts about his brother's decision, his concerns about the stability of the monarchy, and his strategies for rebuilding public confidence in the royal family. Margaret could see how such information might be sensitive, but she still didn't understand why it would be considered a security threat. Nearly 90 years later, surely that period of royal history has been extensively documented by historians and biographers. I can't imagine that the basic facts about the royal family's response to the abdication are still secret. The basic facts are indeed public, Victoria agreed, but these documents contain specific details about family relationships, personal animosities, and strategic discussions that have never been made public. More importantly, they contain information that draws parallels between the challenges faced by the royal family in the 1930s and some of the challenges they face today. This explanation finally helped Margaret understand the true nature of the problem. If the historical documents contained information that could be seen as relevant to current royal family dynamics, then her research might have inadvertently provided insights into contemporary family relationships and decision-making processes. In the highly scrutinized world of modern royalty, even historical parallels could be politically sensitive. I see, Margaret said slowly. So the concern isn't necessarily about the historical information itself, but about what that information might reveal or suggest about current circumstances. Victoria nodded. Exactly. In today's media environment, historical precedents are often used to analyze and predict current royal family behavior. If detailed information about how the royal family handled previous crises became public, it could provide a roadmap for understanding how they might handle current challenges. Margaret felt a wave of frustration. She had been doing exactly the kind of historical research that royal staff had been doing for decades, looking to the past to inform present decisions.
The idea that such research was now considered potentially dangerous seemed to reflect a level of paranoia that was both unreasonable and counterproductive.
"Mrs. Pemberton," Margaret said, "I understand the sensitivity around royal family privacy, but how is historical research supposed to continue if researchers can't access documents that might contain any information relevant to current circumstances? Most historical documents about the royal family contain information that could theoretically be relevant to present-day situations." Victoria's expression suggested that she understood, and perhaps even sympathized with Margaret's frustration. That's exactly why this situation has required such careful consideration at the highest levels of the royal household. The decision has been made to implement new protocols for accessing documents from certain sensitive historical periods. Margaret felt her career slipping away from her.
"And what do these new protocols mean for my position? Will I be able to return to my research work, or is this suspension effectively the end of my role with Queen Camilla?" "That depends largely on how you handle the next few days," Victoria said.
"The royal household values your expertise and your dedication, but there needs to be absolute certainty about your discretion regarding the information you may have encountered during your research." The phrase, "absolute certainty about your discretion," sounded ominous. Margaret had always maintained the highest standards of confidentiality in her work, never discussing royal business outside of official channels, and never socializing in ways that might compromise sensitive information. She couldn't imagine what additional assurances of discretion might be required.
"What kind of additional assurances are you looking for?" Margaret asked. Victoria reached into her handbag and produced a document that was much more extensive than the suspension notice Margaret had received the previous day.
I didn't provide this confidentiality agreement that covers not only your future conduct but also your handling of any information you may have encountered during your recent research activities."
Margaret accepted the document and began reading.
The language was extensive and intimidating, covering not just her professional conduct but also her personal activities, social media presence, and even her casual conversations with friends and family.
The agreement seemed designed to ensure that she could never discuss any aspect of her royal work, even in the most general terms.
"This is quite extensive," Margaret observed. "It seems to go far beyond standard confidentiality requirements." "The circumstances require extraordinary discretion," Victoria replied. "If you can agree to these terms and provide the assurances of confidentiality that the royal household requires, there may be a path forward for continuing your work in a modified capacity." Margaret studied the document more carefully. The modified capacity language was particularly concerning, suggesting that even if she were allowed to return to work, her role and responsibilities would be significantly changed. After 2 years of building expertise and relationships within the royal household, the prospect of starting over in a diminished capacity was deeply disappointing. "I need some time to review this carefully and perhaps consult with a solicitor," Margaret said. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Whitfield, I need to be clear about the urgency of this situation. The royal household needs your decision and your signature on this agreement. Within 24 hours, delays or outside consultations would be viewed as additional evidence of unreliability." The ultimatum was delivered in Victoria's polite, professional tone, but its meaning was unmistakable. Margaret was being forced to choose between signing an agreement that would severely restrict her freedom and losing her position entirely. There would be no opportunity for legal advice, no time for careful consideration, and no room for negotiation. As Victoria prepared to leave, she offered one final piece of information that changed everything Margaret thought she understood about the situation. "Miss Whitfield, I want you to know that Queen Camilla has been personally involved in trying to find a resolution that would allow you to continue your work. However, the concerns that have been raised come from other quarters within the royal family, and their views must also be considered in reaching a final decision." After Victoria left, Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the confidentiality agreement and trying to process the implications of what she had learned. Her research had apparently uncovered historical information that someone in the royal family considered threatening to current royal interests. Queen Camilla supported her, but other family members did not. She was being asked to sign away her rights and freedoms to preserve information that she had accessed accidentally in the course of her legitimate work. The 24-hour deadline loomed like a sword over her head, and Margaret realized that whatever decision she made,
would fundamentally change her life and career forever. Margaret spent a sleepless night wrestling with the impossible choice that Victoria Pemberton had presented to her. The confidentiality agreement lay spread across her kitchen table, its pages filled with legal language that would essentially silence her for life about her work with the royal family. Each clause seemed more restrictive than the last, covering everything from casual conversations with friends to hypothetical future book deals or academic papers. As dawn broke over Windsor, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of signing the agreement or rejecting it outright, she decided to request a direct meeting with Queen Camilla. If she was going to lose her position because of research she had conducted at the Queen's request, she felt she deserved the opportunity to discuss the situation with her employer directly. Margaret spent the morning crafting a carefully worded letter to Queen Camilla's private secretary, explaining her situation and requesting a brief audience to discuss the research project that had apparently caused such concern. She hand-delivered the letter to the private secretary's office at Clarence House, knowing that this action alone might be viewed as inappropriate or even insubordinate by royal household standards. To her surprise, she received a response within 3 hours. Queen Camilla would see her that afternoon at 4 o'clock for a private meeting at Clarence House. The message was brief and formal, but the very fact that the Queen had agreed to see her suggested that Margaret's situation was being taken seriously at the highest levels. Margaret arrived at Clarence House 15 minutes early, her nerves stretched taut with anticipation and anxiety. The familiar surroundings felt different now that she was under a cloud of suspicion. Staff members who had always greeted her warmly now offered only polite nods, suggesting that news of her suspension had spread throughout the royal household. Queen Camilla received her in her private study, a comfortable room lined with books and filled with personal photographs and mementos from the Queen's decades of public service. The Queen looked tired and concerned, suggesting that Margaret's situation had been weighing on her mind as well. "Margaret, please sit down," Queen Camilla said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I must say this entire situation has been quite distressing for me personally. You've been an invaluable member of my team, and I hate to see you caught up in this controversy through no fault of your own." Margaret felt a wave of relief at the Queen's supportive words, but also increased anxiety about what might be coming next. "Your Majesty, I want to assure you that I never intended to access any inappropriate information. I was simply trying to fulfill your research requests as thoroughly and professionally as possible." Queen Camilla nodded. "I know that, Margaret. I've reviewed the research requests I made, and they were entirely legitimate and appropriate for your role. Unfortunately, the documents you accessed in pursuit of that research contained information that has caused considerable concern among other members of the royal family." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, what specific information has caused such concern? I'm trying to understand how historical research about ceremonial protocols could have created a security issue." The Queen paused for a long moment, as if weighing how much she could or should reveal. "Margaret, the documents you accessed contained correspondence and records from the period immediately following the 1936 abdication. That correspondence includes very frank discussions about the challenges facing the monarchy at that time, including concerns about public confidence in the royal family, and strategies for rebuilding that confidence. And someone believes that information could be relevant to current circumstances?" "Precisely," Queen Camilla confirmed. "There are members of the family who believe that the parallels between the challenges we faced then and some of the challenges we face now could be used by the media or by critics of the monarchy to suggest patterns of behavior or decision-making that might be damaging to our current position." Margaret felt increasingly frustrated by what seemed like an overreaction to historical research. "But, Your Majesty, surely historians and royal biographers have written extensively about that period. How can information from nearly 90 years ago still be considered sensitive?" Queen Camilla's expression suggested that she shared some of Margaret's frustration, but was constrained by larger family and institutional concerns. "You're absolutely right that the basic facts of that period are well documented. However, the specific documents you accessed contain details about family discussions, personal relationships, and strategic thinking that have never been made public." Margaret realized that she needed to understand exactly which family members had raised concerns about her research.
Your Majesty, may I ask who specifically has expressed concerns about my work? I want to understand if this is about the research itself, or about concerns that I might somehow misuse the information I've encountered. Queen Camilla chose her words carefully. The concerns were initially raised by members of the family who have particular sensitivity about how royal history is documented and discussed publicly. Those concerns were then brought to the king's attention, and he felt that the situation required immediate review. Margaret sensed that she wasn't getting the full story about the family dynamics involved, but she also understood that Queen Camilla was probably not free to discuss internal family disagreements in detail. What options do I have for moving forward? Victoria Pemberton presented me with a confidentiality agreement that seems quite restrictive. Yes, I've seen that agreement, Queen Camilla said. Margaret, I want to be completely honest with you about the difficult position we're all in. The king has made it clear that your continued employment requires not only signing that agreement, but also accepting significant restrictions on your future research activities. Margaret's heart sank. What kind of restrictions? You would no longer have access to any documents dated before 1960, and all future research requests would need to be pre-approved not just by my office, but also by the king's private secretary. Additionally, your research would be limited to ceremonial and protocol matters, with no access to documents containing information about family relationships or decision-making processes. The restrictions would essentially gut Margaret's ability to do meaningful historical research. Royal ceremonies and protocols were deeply intertwined with the family dynamics and political circumstances of their time. Trying to understand ceremonial precedents without understanding the context in which they developed would make her work superficial and largely useless. Your Majesty, Margaret said carefully, those restrictions would make it very difficult for me to provide you with the kind of thorough, contextual research that has been the foundation of my work for your office. Historical protocols can't be properly understood without understanding the circumstances that shaped them. Queen Camilla nodded sadly. I know, Margaret. That's exactly why this situation is so frustrating for me. I value the depth and insight of your research, but I'm being told that such comprehensive historical investigation is no longer considered appropriate for your level of clearance. Margaret felt her professional world crumbling around her. Is there any possibility of appealing this decision or perhaps meeting with the king's representatives to discuss alternative arrangements? I'm afraid the decision has been made at the highest level, Queen Camilla replied. However, I want you to know that I've been advocating for you throughout this process. I've made it clear to everyone involved that you are a person of absolute integrity, and that your research has always been conducted in service of legitimate royal business. Margaret appreciated the Queen's support, but it was clear that other influences were stronger. Your Majesty, may I ask about the timeline for making a decision? Victoria Pemberton said I had 24 hours to decide about the confidentiality agreement. Queen Camilla looked uncomfortable. That timeline was set by the king's security advisors, not by me. They believe that any delay in resolving this matter increases the security risk associated with the information you may have encountered. Margaret realized that she was being treated not as a trusted employee who had accidentally accessed sensitive information, but as a potential security threat who needed to be contained immediately. The shift in how she was being perceived was both professionally devastating and personally insulting. Your Majesty, I need you to understand that I have never discussed my work with anyone outside of official channels, and I have no intention of ever doing so. My loyalty to the royal family and to you personally is absolute. I know that, Margaret, and I've said so repeatedly to everyone involved in this decision. Unfortunately, the current climate around royal privacy and security has made everyone extremely cautious about any potential risks, no matter how small or theoretical they might be. Margaret began to understand that her situation was not really about her personally, or even about her research specifically. She was being caught up in larger concerns about royal family privacy and security that had been heightened by recent media scrutiny and public criticism of the monarchy. What happens if I don't sign the confidentiality agreement? Margaret asked. Queen Camilla's expression became even sadder. Then your employment would be terminated immediately, and you would be required to sign a different agreement that would prevent you from discussing any aspect of your work with the royal family. Ever.
Ever!
Margaret realized that she was being presented with an illusion of choice,
Whether she signed the restrictive confidentiality agreement or refused to sign it, her career in royal service was effectively over. The only difference was whether she would be allowed to continue in a severely limited capacity or would be dismissed entirely. Your Majesty, I have to ask directly, do you want me to continue working for you under these restrictions, or would you prefer that I resign and allow you to find a replacement who can work more freely within the new parameters? Queen Camilla paused for a long moment before answering.
Margaret, what I want is for this entire situation to disappear and for you to continue the excellent work you've been doing for the past 2 years. Unfortunately, what I want and what I can achieve given the current circumstances are two different things. Margaret understood that Queen Camilla was telling her as diplomatically as possible that the restrictions being imposed would make Margaret's continued employment more trouble than it was worth. The Queen needed a researcher who could access a full range of historical documents and provide comprehensive analysis, not someone who would be severely limited in what they could investigate.
I think I understand, Your Majesty, Margaret said quietly. You need someone who can do the job properly, and these restrictions would prevent me from doing that.
I'm so very sorry, Margaret. This outcome is not what I wanted, and it's not what you deserve after your dedicated service.
As Margaret prepared to leave Clarence House for what she suspected might be the last time, Queen Camilla offered one final piece of information that would haunt Margaret for months to come. Margaret, I want you to know that there are documents you never accessed that contain much more sensitive information than anything you encountered.
The family's concern is not really about what you know, but about establishing a precedent for how such situations are handled in the future. Walking away from Clarence House, Margaret realized that she had become collateral damage in a larger battle about royal transparency and security. Her career had been sacrificed not because of anything she had done wrong, but because her situation provided an opportunity for certain members of the royal family to tighten control over historical information and set new precedents for handling potential security concerns. The injustice of it was overwhelming, but Margaret also understood that fighting it would be futile. She had been outmaneuvered by forces much more powerful than herself, and her only choice now was to decide how to move forward with her life after losing the career she had worked so hard to build. Margaret returned to her flat that evening with her mind made up. She would not sign the restrictive confidentiality agreement, nor would she accept a position that would essentially make her work meaningless. Instead, she would submit her resignation and try to rebuild her career outside the royal household. The decision brought her a measure of peace, but it also filled her with sadness about leaving work she had truly loved. She spent the evening drafting her resignation letter, carefully choosing words that would maintain her dignity while making it clear that she was leaving because the new restrictions would prevent her from doing her job effectively. She avoided any criticism of the royal family or the decision-making process, knowing that such comments would only confirm the security concerns that had been raised about her discretion. The next morning, Margaret delivered her resignation letter to Victoria Pemberton's office, along with the unsigned confidentiality agreement. She expected this to be the end of her involvement with the situation, but she was wrong. Within hours, she received a call requesting that she return to Clarence House for another meeting, this time with representatives of the King's private office. Margaret arrived at the appointed time to find herself facing 3 people she had never met before. 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as senior advisors to the king, and a woman who was identified only as representing the royal family's legal interests. The atmosphere in the meeting room was formal and intimidating, quite different from her previous conversations with Queen Camilla and Victoria Pemberton. "Miss Whitfield," began the senior advisor, whose name was given as Sir Richard Blackwood, "your resignation has been noted, but there are still matters that need to be resolved before your departure from royal service can be finalized." Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. "What matters? I've returned all royal property in my possession, and I've confirmed that I have no copies of any documents or research materials." Sir Richard consulted a file in front of him. "The concern is about the information that may be retained in your memory from your research activities. Even though you haven't taken any physical documents or notes, you may have knowledge of sensitive information that could potentially be problematic if it were ever to become public." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Are you suggesting that I could be held responsible for remembering information that I encountered in the course of my legitimate work? I'm not a computer that can be wiped clean of inconvenient data."
The legal representative, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Patricia Ashford, leaned forward. Miss Whitfield, the royal family takes its privacy and security very seriously. When employees have access to sensitive historical information, there are ongoing obligations regarding that information even after employment ends. Margaret felt her frustration building. What specific information are you concerned about? I've already explained that I was researching ceremonial protocols, not family secrets. If there was sensitive information in those documents, I wasn't focusing on it or taking particular note of it. Sir Richard opened a folder and began reading from what appeared to be a detailed summary of Margaret's research activities. According to our records, you accessed documents that contained correspondence between King George VI and Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin regarding strategies for rebuilding public confidence after the abdication crisis. You also accessed private letters between King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, discussing their concerns about the stability of the monarchy and their plans for ensuring a smooth succession to their daughter. Margaret was surprised by the detailed knowledge of her research activities. Someone had been monitoring her work much more closely than she had realized. Yes, I may have encountered such information, but I was looking for information about how the royal family handled public ceremonies during that difficult period. I wasn't taking notes on personal letters or private correspondence. Mrs. Ashford spoke again. The concern is not about what notes you took, but about what you might remember and what you might potentially discuss or write about in the future. The royal family needs assurance that such information will never be used in any way that could be harmful to current interests. Margaret realized that she was being asked to guarantee not just her future behavior, but her future thoughts and memories. The absurdity of the request was matched only by the apparent seriousness with which it was being made. How exactly am I supposed to provide such assurance? Margaret asked. Are you asking me to promise to never think about anything I learned during my research? To suffer from selective amnesia about my own professional experiences? The second advisor, who had been introduced as Mr. James Whitmore, finally spoke. Miss Whitfield, we understand that this situation is unusual, but the circumstances require extraordinary measures. The royal family is prepared to offer you a substantial financial settlement in exchange for signing an agreement that would provide the strongest possible legal protections against any future disclosure of sensitive information. Margaret felt as though she was being offered a bribe to stay quiet about information she had never intended to disclose in the first place. What kind of financial settlement? Sir Richard named a figure that was indeed substantial, enough to support Margaret comfortably for several years while she rebuilt her career. The offer was tempting, but it came with strings attached that made Margaret deeply uncomfortable. The settlement would be contingent upon your signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would cover not only specific information, but also your general impressions and insights from your work with the royal family, Mrs. Biz Ashford explained. You would also agree to notify the royal legal team of any future employment opportunities, book deals, or media contacts that might potentially involve discussion of royal matters. Margaret realized that accepting the settlement would essentially mean giving up her independence and subjecting her future career decisions to royal family approval. The money was attractive, but the cost in terms of personal freedom was enormous. What happens if I decline both the settlement and the non-disclosure agreement? Margaret asked. The three advisors exchanged glances before Sir Richard answered. Then you would be free to leave royal service, but the royal family would reserve all legal rights regarding any potential future disclosure of confidential information. You would essentially be leaving under a cloud of legal uncertainty that could affect your future career prospects. Margaret understood the implicit threat. If she didn't sign their agreement, she would face the possibility of legal action if she ever said or wrote anything that the royal family considered inappropriate. The uncertainty would hang over her for the rest of her career, potentially deterring future employers and limiting her professional opportunities. I need time to think about this, Margaret said. Unfortunately, the offer is only available if you accept it today, Mr. Whitmore replied. The royal family needs to resolve this matter quickly and completely. Margaret felt trapped. Every option presented to her involved some form of surrender, either of her principles, her independence, or her financial security. The royal family had carefully constructed a situation where she had no good choices, only degrees of capitulation. Before I make a decision, Margaret said,
I want to understand exactly what information has caused such concern. I think I deserve to know what I supposedly know that's so dangerous. Sir Richard consulted his file again. The documents you accessed contain specific details about the royal family's strategic thinking during the abdication crisis, including their assessment of public opinion, their concerns about the future of the monarchy, and their plans for managing the transition to King George VI's reign. Margaret could see how such information might be considered sensitive, but she still didn't understand why it would be relevant to current circumstances nearly 90 years later. Are you suggesting that this historical information could somehow be damaging to the current royal family? Ashford answered carefully. The concern is that this information could be used to draw parallels between the challenges faced by the royal family in the 1930s and challenges they face today. In the current media environment, such historical precedents could be used to analyze or predict current royal family behavior and decision-making. Finally, Margaret understood the real issue. The royal family was not concerned about the historical information itself, but about how that information might be used to understand and interpret current royal family dynamics. Her research had inadvertently provided insights into royal family crisis management strategies that were apparently still relevant today. I see, Margaret said slowly. So this is really about current royal family concerns, not historical ones. Sir Richard nodded. The monarchy has always relied on a certain degree of privacy and mystique to maintain its effectiveness. Information that provides too much insight into royal family decision-making processes, even historical information, can potentially undermine that mystique. Margaret realized that she had become caught up in a much larger discussion about the role of the monarchy in modern British society, and the balance between transparency and privacy that the royal family needed to maintain. Her research had accidentally touched on issues that went to the heart of how the monarchy functioned and survived. What specific assurances would you need from me? Margaret asked. Mrs. Ashford produced a document that was even more comprehensive than the previous confidentiality agreements Margaret had seen. This agreement would cover not only specific information but also your general insights about royal family behavior, your understanding of royal protocols and decision-making processes, and your impressions of royal family relationships and dynamics. Margaret read through the document carefully. It was so broad and comprehensive that it would essentially prevent her from ever working in any field related to royal history, British politics, or even general historical research. The restrictions would follow her for the rest of her career and potentially affect even casual conversations with friends and family. This agreement would essentially end my career as a historian, Margaret observed. It would restrict certain types of historical work, Sir Richard acknowledged. But the financial settlement would provide you with the freedom to pursue other career paths without the need to work in sensitive areas. Margaret understood that she was being asked to accept financial compensation for giving up her professional calling. The royal family was essentially offering to buy her silence and her career in order to protect information that she had encountered by accident in the course of her legitimate work. As she sat in the meeting room surrounded by royal advisors and legal representatives, Margaret realized that this moment would define the rest of her life. She could accept their offer and live comfortably but without professional fulfillment. Or she could refuse and face an uncertain future shadowed by legal threats and professional limitations. The decision was hers, but all of her options had been carefully crafted by people far more powerful than herself, and none of them offered her the justice or vindication that she felt she deserved. I need a few minutes to think, Margaret said. Of course, Sir Richard replied. Take all the time you need. But Margaret knew that no amount of time would change the fundamental unfairness of her situation. She had been loyal, professional, and discreet, but none of that mattered when set against the royal family's determination to control information that they considered potentially threatening to their interests. Margaret sat in the meeting room for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, weighing her options and trying to find a path forward that would preserve both her integrity and her future. The three royal advisors waited patiently, occasionally exchanging glances, but saying nothing that might influence her decision. The silence in the room was oppressive, filled with the weight of consequences that would extend far beyond this single afternoon. Finally, Margaret looked up at Sir Richard Blackwood and made her choice. I appreciate the financial offer, she said carefully, but I cannot in good conscience sign an agreement that would prevent me from pursuing my career as a historian.
My work is my calling, not just my job, and I'm not willing to abandon it for any amount of money." Sir Richard nodded as if he had expected this response. "We understand your position, Miss Whitfield. However, I must emphasize that declining our offer does not absolve you of your obligations regarding confidential information you may have encountered during your employment." Margaret felt a flash of anger at the continued implications about her trustworthiness. "Sir Richard, I want to be absolutely clear about something. I have never betrayed a confidence, never gossiped about royal family matters, and never used my position for personal gain. I deeply resent the suggestion that I might do so in the future simply because I won't sign away my professional rights." Mrs. Priscilla, Ashford leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield, no one is questioning your integrity. However, the royal family must consider all potential risks, regardless of your past behavior or your stated intentions." Margaret realized that her personal reputation and track record meant nothing in the face of institutional paranoia. The royal family was treating her as a potential threat, not because of anything she had done, but because she possessed knowledge that they wished she didn't have. "What exactly happens now?" Margaret asked. Mr. Whitmore consulted his notes. "Your resignation from royal service will be processed immediately. You will be required to return any remaining royal property and confirm in writing that you have no copies of any documents or materials from your work." Margaret had already done this, but she nodded her agreement. "And then?" "Then you will be free to pursue your career as you see fit," Sir Richard said, "with the understanding that the royal family reserves all legal rights regarding any information you may have encountered during your employment." Margaret understood that this was not really freedom at all, but a form of legal limbo that would hang over her for the rest of her career. Any future employer would need to consider the possibility that hiring her might expose them to legal challenges from the royal family. Any publisher would need to weigh the risk of royal legal action before accepting her work. She was being released with a permanent cloud of uncertainty that would follow her wherever she went. "Is there any possibility of obtaining a written statement that would clarify exactly what information is considered confidential and what I'm free to discuss?" Margaret asked. "I want to avoid any future misunderstandings." Mrs. Ashford shook her head. "The nature of confidential information is such that it cannot be specifically catalogued without risking further disclosure. You will need to use your best judgment about what might be considered sensitive." Margaret realized that this deliberately vague standard would make her vulnerable to accusations of inappropriate disclosure, even if she spoke about matters that she reasonably believed to be public knowledge. The royal family was creating a situation where they could claim that almost anything she said about her work fell under their definition of confidential information. "This seems deliberately designed to prevent me from working in my field," Margaret observed. Sir Richard's expression remained professionally neutral. "Miss Whitfield, the royal family has no desire to interfere with your legitimate career aspirations. However, they also have a right to protect confidential information and to take appropriate legal action if that information is misused." Margaret stood up, recognizing that the meeting had accomplished everything the royal advisors had intended. She had been effectively neutralized as a potential source of sensitive information, without the royal family having to pay the financial settlement they had offered. She would leave royal service under conditions that would make her future career prospects uncertain and potentially dangerous. "I assume this concludes our business," Margaret said. "Almost," Sir Richard replied. "There is one final matter to address." Margaret waited, wondering what additional humiliation might be in store. "The king wishes you to know that this decision was not made lightly, and that your service to Queen Camilla has been appreciated," Sir Richard continued. "However, the security of the royal family must take precedence over all other considerations." Margaret felt a bitter irony in receiving the king's appreciation at the same time that his advisors were destroying her career. "Please convey my gratitude to His Majesty for his consideration." Mrs. Ashford handed Margaret a business card. "If you have any questions about your ongoing obligations regarding confidential information, please contact my office directly." Margaret pocketed the card, knowing that she would probably never use it. Any contact with the royal legal team would only serve to remind them of her existence and potentially trigger additional restrictions or concerns. As Margaret prepared to leave Clarence House for the final time, Mr. Whitmore offered one last comment that revealed more about the royal family's concerns than anything else that had been said during the meeting. Miss Whitfield, you should know that this situation has prompted a comprehensive review of access protocols for all historical documents. Your case has been instrumental in helping the royal family develop new security procedures that will prevent similar situations in the future. Margaret realized that her professional destruction had served a larger purpose for the royal family. She had become a test case that allowed them to establish new precedents for controlling access to historical information and dealing with employees who might encounter sensitive materials. Her career had been sacrificed not just to protect specific information, but to send a message to all current and future royal employees about the consequences of accessing information that the royal family preferred to keep private. Walking away from Clarence House, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was angry about the injustice of her treatment, sad about the end of work she had loved, and anxious about her uncertain future. But she was also strangely proud that she had refused to sign away her professional integrity, even when faced with significant financial incentives and legal threats. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to understand the full extent of how her situation would affect her career prospects. Word had quietly spread through the close-knit community of royal historians and archivists that she had left royal service under controversial circumstances. While the specific details remained confidential, the mere fact of her sudden departure after a security review was enough to make potential employers cautious about associating with her. Margaret found herself effectively blacklisted from positions that involved access to government archives, royal collections, or sensitive historical materials. Universities were reluctant to hire someone who might bring legal complications or negative attention from the royal family. Publishers were wary of commissioning work from an author who might face legal challenges to her publications. The royal family had achieved their objective without having to take any overt action against Margaret. They had created a situation where she was professionally isolated, not by their direct intervention, but by the chilling effect of uncertainty and fear among her potential colleagues and employers. 3 months after leaving royal service, Margaret finally received an unexpected phone call that provided some closure to her ordeal. Dr. Harrison, the chief archivist who had been so apologetic on the day of her suspension, contacted her to share some information that had come to light about her case. Margaret, Dr. Grease. Harrison said quietly, I think you should know that the documents you accessed have now been completely reclassified and removed from general circulation. The entire section of archives dealing with the 1930s and 1940s has been placed under the highest level of security restrictions. Margaret wasn't surprised by this news, but it confirmed her suspicions about the broader implications of her situation. So this was never really about me personally? I don't think so, Harrison replied. I think you accidentally uncovered information that certain members of the royal family had forgotten was accessible to researchers. Your case provided them with the justification they needed to lock down that entire period of royal history. Margaret realized that she had been caught up in a larger battle about royal transparency and historical access that had been brewing for years. Her research had simply provided the catalyst for changes that were probably inevitable given the royal family's increasing sensitivity about privacy and public scrutiny. What's happened to the research I was doing for Queen Camilla? Margaret asked. Harrison sighed. It's been reassigned to a senior archivist who has much more limited access and is focusing only on ceremonial protocols without any historical context. The Queen is reportedly frustrated with the superficial nature of the work, but her hands are tied by the new restrictions. Margaret felt vindicated in her decision not to accept a position under the restrictive new protocols. The work that remained available would have been professionally unsatisfying and intellectually dishonest. Harrison, Margaret said, do you think this situation will affect other researchers and historians? It already has, he replied sadly. The new protocols affect anyone doing research on royal history from the 19th and 20th centuries. Several ongoing academic projects have been suspended, and some researchers have been forced to completely change their dissertation topics. Margaret understood that her case had far-reaching implications beyond her personal situation. The royal family's response to her research had effectively closed off entire areas of British history to scholarly investigation, limiting the ability of historians to understand and analyze the development of the modern monarchy. As she ended the call with Dr. Binlow, Harrison, Margaret reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She had entered royal service hoping to contribute to historical understanding and to support Queen Camilla's important work. Instead, she had inadvertently triggered a crackdown on historical research that would affect scholars for generations to come. Margaret eventually rebuilt her career by focusing on non-royal British history and finding ways to work around the implicit restrictions that had been placed on her professional activities. She never again accessed royal archives or worked directly with materials that might be considered sensitive by the royal family. The experience had taught her that in the world of royal politics, individual careers and even historical truth could be sacrificed to protect institutional interests. Years later, Margaret would occasionally wonder what information she had encountered that was so sensitive that it required such extreme measures to contain. She had never focused on the personal letters and strategic discussions that had apparently caused such concern, but she couldn't help but speculate about what secrets from the 1930s remained relevant to royal family concerns in the 21st century. The answer, she realized, would probably never be known by anyone outside the highest levels of the royal household. Her case had ensured that future researchers would never have access to the materials that had cost her career, and the royal family's secrets from that turbulent period would remain safely hidden behind new layers of security and bureaucracy. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale whispered among royal historians and archivists, a reminder that even the most dedicated and professional researchers could find themselves caught up in forces beyond their control when powerful institutions felt threatened by the pursuit of historical truth.